I would want to shout it to the top of my lungs. I'd be like, you got to watch this because this means something and this means this and that and that. And I want to do that with my own stories. I want people to kind of feel the same way, feel connected to themselves or a situation or whatever. Just have a good time, escapism, whatever you want to use the story for. I just hope you can connect to it. And that is definitely my biggest goal, my biggest drive is just connection.
Let's talk nerdy things like comic books and superheroes with some nerdy peeps, writers, cartoonists, and so much more. So stick around and have some fun with the lovely and adorable Eva Webb.
Hello, my lovelies. Welcome to Titular Characters. I am your adorable host, Eva Webb, and in this issue, we're featuring Kat Calamia. Kat is the writer of indie comic books Like Father, Like Daughter, and They Call Her the Dancer. Next to her weekly comic book reviews on Comic Uno, Kat also currently works for Newsarama with bylines at DC Universe, IGN, Fandom, and TV Guide. And we're going to get to talk to her about all of it. This is super exciting. Welcome, Kat. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I guess the place to start is, where are you from? Where does your journey begin?
My journey. I'm from New York, actually. Yeah, so it's a crazy place, right? I'm from Staten Island, New York, which is even crazier. Yeah, that's where my journey starts, and I do currently live there as well.
Awesome. What was the first comic book you remember?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So I started reading comics. Honestly, I don't remember when I started because my dad used to read comics to me when I was super young. He was into like the Silver Age DC comics, so instead of reading like Cinderella, we'd read Silver Age Superman. And I don't remember what the first Superman book was, but I remember it was a Superman book. And then when I started reading comics myself more and getting my own collection, somehow I turned to Marvel more. So I think because I'm 26, so back in 2002, I was in second grade, and the new Spider-Man movie came out, the Tobey Maguire movie came out, and I loved it. And then, X-Men Evolution was coming out at that time as well. So I really enjoyed X-Men. So I started finding X-Men books and Spider-Man books, but still, enjoying DC. And then in high school, I started to really dive into both companies a bit more. I started doing my YouTube channel, which I still do. So I've been doing that for like 10 years. And I started reviewing comics. I got into DC a little bit more again. And obviously I was always still into Marvel. And then learning more about indie comics and just, throughout that time, and still finding new comics and finding new avenues to read comics.
Nice. What was your first comics project?
My first writing comic project was Like Father, Like Daughter, and that started about 5 years ago. It's an ongoing book. It's still going. We just released issue 7 of Like Father, Like Daughter to our Kickstarter backers, and that was digitally, and we're getting ready to get the print copies and send that off to Kickstarter backers and get it off to everybody after that, whoever wants to buy it. But yeah, so the first one was issue 1 5 years ago, and continuing that journey. And currently now I'm just about to launch another Kickstarter for my other project. They Call Her the Dancer. And this book has kind of been done for a while, but we have now colored it and finally releasing all 4 issues, which is exciting. So yeah, that's kind of what's currently on the slate.
What has been your experience with artistic collaborations? Has it been easy, or has it taken some time to really find your groove?
I think it's always different with each artist. Even going from like a cover that you're trying to look for, you figure out your groove as you begin a relationship with your artist. And for me, I always try to give enough wiggle room. That way, that artist feels like they have a part of the comic and not just following my director cut of a script. So I really try to give enough wiggle room to the artist and try to talk to the artist as much as I can so they feel a part of it and because they are a part of it and it's part of this collaboration. So it's kind of cool. Yeah, every project I feel like there's just a different voice and a different relationship with each artist I connect with.
Do you have any favorites, like as far as what you've put out so far? Is that a terrible
Oh,
question to ask?
no, I love it. Again, I think each artist gives something different. I think I've gotten some really cool variant covers in the past that have really spoke to me. I have Paper Cats, who's done a lot of comic covers for us, which I love her work, and it's just so cool to see what she brings to the table. Comicer Girl, who has worked for DC Comics, who does a really cool like cartoony variant cover. Going into sequentials, the three main artists I've worked with, Wayne Brown, who does like Follow My Daughter, brings this kind of like 90s feel to the book, which is kind of cool, a little cartoonier. So that's interesting, and that's the first artist I really talked to for sequential. So we have a really close relationship. And then Evie Katadas, who works on the current book I'm doing Kickstarter for, they call her Dancer. With issues 1 through 4, it wasn't as back and forth. It was more, here's the script, and it may sometimes you have some notes, and he always brings something really interesting to the table. And I really like his action sequences the most. And I also love my colorist who works on, they call her Dancer, because it's interesting because the Dancer's been done for about a year, so I haven't talked to my artist as much for that book. But now I'm currently coloring the book, so I've been talking to the colorist a lot, and I just love what he's been bringing to the table. And now currently I'm working on a crossover book with like Follow My Daughter and my really good friend Phil, who does The Haunting, and we're doing a 40-page high school horror superhero book. And we're currently working with the artist Rafi, and she's absolutely amazing. And again, it's just really cool to see different sides of different artists. I don't know if I could pick a favorite, but I think they all have very different things they bring to the table.
What kind of writer are you? Are you the type of writer that describes things loosely or in summary, or the type of writer that, writes like 100,000-page comic, or in terms of type?
I would say I'm kind of in the middle. I would lean more towards loosely because, like I said before, I really do want the artist to have much of a voice as possible. But I don't usually say, and they fight here. Like I'm a little bit more descriptive than that, and I do the full script version of comics. I know some people do like, okay, I'll work on a baseline and then I'll, you work with the artist to kind of figure out the story. I definitely am more of a full script person. So that's why I say I'm like more in the middle. I do describe things, but I am very flexible to change things if the artist sees something different. And I don't usually have like 100-page script for a 20-page book. So it's usually not that long, but I try to be very succinct with the words I use to describe things. That way it's not too long.
So when you're writing, what place do you go to internally? Is it, well, I guess, where do you find your zen as a writer?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I feel like it's always in different places, and it's different when it depends on the story. I do tend to tell very emotionally driven stories because a lot of my stories are character driven. Not that they aren't plot driven, but if I had to choose one, they're more character driven. So if I'm writing in a really angsty comic, I definitely try to be in an angsty mood. I'm going to listen to some really angsty music. Music definitely drives me a lot. I would say I'm always listening to music when I'm writing. And, it's a little harder with COVID, but it's nice to say, oh, you can go outside and take a walk or something and clear your head. And I guess you can still do that, but like going to a coffee shop, you can't do that anymore. So, looking at different four walls, it's like, all right, I'll change my spot from the kitchen table to the couch now. But yeah, I always try to change my surroundings a little. And I also work very well at night. So I tend to write, I think, my best stuff at night, and maybe it's because of the more angsty stuff I'm writing. But if I'm thinking of like a good joke, like a good back and forth between characters, I see myself doing that more during the day. Like, okay, just like I'm in the shower or whatever, and I'll think of like a really good back and forth between the two characters or whoever's in a scene. So yeah, I think it just depends on what scene I'm writing and what type of story I'm writing. But yeah, music definitely is what helps the most to get me in the mood.
That's really cool. Yeah, music is a lot of fun. It's just like pure emotion, whatever
Oh,
the
for
song
sure.
is. It's really easy to internalize that. So you've also done work for Newsarama and for DC Universe.
Yeah, yeah. So Newsarama, I currently work for, and I've been working there since 2017. So it's been a while. And I started doing reviews over there for them. So because of the YouTube reviews, I also went to school for communications, and I had a minor in journalism. So when I graduated, I was like, okay, what do I do next? And I wanted to write comics, and obviously that's a long trail. So I was writing my comics, but at the same time, I was like, I got to do something else to make money. So journalism was the second best thing. And so I started working at Newsarama. And then as I started to do more for them, they gave me more assignments, especially after I did some stuff for them at Comic-Con. And now I'm mostly their DC beat writer, which is interesting. As I said earlier in the interview, I was more of a Marvel fan growing up, and still am. So it's interesting how much DC work I've done over the years. But yeah, I do a lot of their DC stuff. Not that I don't cover other stuff. Like just this week, I had an Avatar article that showed up. So it also just depends on what assignments are available. So I do a lot for Newsarama. That's kind of currently the big thing I do. And then DC Universe sadly just closed. So here and there, I'll pitch for DC Comics, and I've had a couple of articles that went on DCComics.com. But yeah, DC Universe, I a really fun time working there. I loved the people, and I loved we're talking about DC Comics for the official DC Comics website, subscription service. So that was really fun, and just like a lot of that is those assignments are kind of different from Newsarama, because Newsarama's a lot of the assignments we did some backlog stuff, but a lot of it is okay, what's coming out next. And for DC Comics, all the stuff that was in their library were from like 6 months before, so it was about kind of digging into the DC library to make assignments and to pitch articles. So that's kind of cool. It was really fun to work for them, and hopefully in the future I'll do more for them freelance wise. But yeah, DC Universe was pretty cool.
So you've done both journalism and creative writing. Is it a big shift in your head when you're doing one or the other? Is there a huge difference between the two?
Yeah, I would say they're somewhat complete opposites, but they do work hand in hand. So like in a criticism point of view, you're dissecting a comic, right? You're trying to figure out, okay, what works, what doesn't work in your opinion, and why doesn't it work? And for writing, you do that, but it's a little harder because it's so personal. So not like you can't get so much into your head in that first draft, right? So the first draft, you're like, I just got to write this thing. But then at least for me, I can use my journalism skills and use my being a critic and my background of being a critic, and say, okay, if I wasn't the writer of this, how would I review this? And what are things I could fix? So it actually really helps me in those second, third, fourth drafts where I'm like, okay, this is what I would do. Like, how do you sell a comic? What would people be interested in? Is this a good cliffhanger? Would people want to buy the next issue? So yeah, in some ways they work hand in hand, but in other ways they're the complete opposite. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I love balancing both. And I get to talk to, as a writer, it's kind of cool to get to talk to so many different people in the industry, and also just learn all different sides through journalism and through asking questions.
Earlier, you were talking about being a character writer, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really interesting because, just all the different people that have to live in your head to do that. How do you get the voices right when you write 2 or 3 or 5 different characters to make them sound unique?
I think it has to do with their circumstances. That's kind of really how I find their voice. And yeah, it's interesting. I think the more I write is the more I get to learn about them. And for me, and just like any writer, I think outlining is really important. And one thing I do with outlining, though, is that I'll outline the story and say, okay, this is where the plot's going. But sometimes I'll write little scenes, even if they don't have to do with the comic, but just to kind of figure out, okay, how did these two bounce off each other? And then you also figure out their personal journeys. Just like any writing, the big question always is, in every scene, in every comic, every story you write, is what do they want? So everyone's wants are different, and everyone's personalities connected to their wants are going to be different, how they react to trying to get that. So I think that's definitely a big part of finding people's voices. And it's interesting because I think some of the stories I write, they'll have similar themes, but the characters will be very different in how they react to them. So yeah, it's always a journey for sure to figure it all out. And I think as you write, you continue to learn more about your characters. But I don't know, I feel like it's just an instinct. I hate to say that. I wish it was a more constructive way of saying that. But I think as you write, it just kind of happens.
What's your favorite type of story to tell?
Oh man, my favorite type of story to tell. From what I noticed, I would say characters that their worst enemy is always themselves. So there could be a villain involved, and there probably is, because you have to have an antagonist. But I think learning to look within yourself and figure out who you are is definitely a big part of the type of stories I tell. Yeah.
Right on. Is it hard to engineer conflict in situations that makes the story exciting?
Yes and no. I think the hardest part is when there's conflict and you don't want people to hate your character, right? Like there could be, like with Like Father Like Daughter, the conflict is that her dad left her 10 years ago to be a superhero. There's no other superhero in the world, and she has to see him every day. And then she gets his superpowers. So there's a lot of conflict there. And on both sides, when you're reading that, well, how do you not make him vulnerable as a superhero, the dad? Like, how do you not make him, the bad guy? And because he is the bad guy in a lot of ways. He left his daughter to do this. But then as the story goes on, you see it's a lot more complicated than that. You see why he left, and maybe he's an okay guy. And then you're like, well, why should I root for this person? And same thing for Casey. Casey's the main character, the daughter. She has anger issues because her dad left her. And, sometimes she has rash decisions that she has to make. So I think trying to navigate of how do you make your characters likable within that conflict. And that's always a hardship. It definitely is a hardship. And do they always have to be likable? And trying to figure out interesting and likable are not always the same thing sometimes. And just figuring out how you want your readers connect to those characters within their conflict. So yeah, just like anything, I think it's a learning curve, and you just kind of figure it out as you go along, and as you learn more about your story yourself and learn more about your characters. So I think it's the most difficult thing for sure, is just keeping that balancing act.
Do your characters ever get away from you?
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of my twists a lot of my comics have a lot of twists in them, and I handle it with stride. If my character wants to say something else than I planned, I go with it and see if it works. And I think that's always a part of writing and rewriting, is figuring out, okay, maybe this was my original plan, but it could be something completely different. Like I'm writing a comic now, which I won't spoil what's happening, but the concept was very different as I was creating it. And it was a little bit more bubblegummy. It's supposed to be very Legally Blonde in some ways. And now as I continue to write it, and I kind of figured out the main character's voice, it took me a while, but when I figured out the main character's voice and what was going on, it kind of became more of like a 6 Feet Under black comedy, like a dark comedy. So it just as you write, you kind of figure it out. And again, it is hard, but I love seeing my characters develop. I like seeing them have their own voices and figuring out the story. And I'd say a lot of my characters have done that. If you read Like Father Like Daughter, the main character Casey has been pretty similar, and Invulnerable's journey has been similar, but there's the twist of, spoiler alert, but if you read the comic, issue 5, we learned that the true villain of the story was always Casey's mom. So she worked for the KGB, and she's the villain of the story. So that wasn't the original plan when I wrote Like Father Like Daughter. It came as I was writing the story more, and I'm like, oh, well, that'd be an interesting twist. And that would bring a lot more family drama, and that would bring like a lot more to a head and a lot more conflict. So that was kind of different. And I would say a lot of the supporting characters, I found their voices a little bit more and how they stand out. So yeah, it's kind of cool to see how stories develop and change. And I think that's one of my favorite parts of writing.
What drives you?
Ooh, what drives me? That is such a good question. I just want to tell stories, honestly. I want people to connect. I think for a long time, like I would find like a show or a story I really liked, and I would want to shout it to the top of my lungs. I'd be like, you got to watch this because this means something, and this means this and that and that. And I want to do that with my own stories. I want people to kind of feel the same way, feel connected to themselves or a situation or whatever. Just have a good time, escapism, whatever you want to use the story for. I just hope you can connect to it, and that is definitely my biggest goal, my biggest drive is just connection.
I love that. I just love that.
Thank
I think
you.
that's really cool. So, can you think of advice that you would give writers?
I think just the advice I want to give in general to writers is because I feel like the normal advice a lot of writers get is to write every day, which I do agree with that. I think you should write every day and write as often as you can. But at the same time, I think just trying to let the pages flow and let the characters speak for themselves and to let the inspiration strike. But again, sometimes if inspiration doesn't strike, you also need to stare at that blank piece of paper sometimes too. So I think it's the balancing act of both is that, try to not stress yourself out so much, but at the same time, be as productive as you can. And I think that's a hardship everyone tries to find and hope everyone is able to find that for themselves.
That's really cool. That's some great advice, actually. So, what makes a character stand out in your mind? What makes them really exciting and compelling when you write a story?
It's interesting because I think it's always different with every story. Because sometimes I think about a story within, which I am a character writer, as I mentioned, but sometimes I think about the plot first, right? It's like, okay, well, what does the character want? What are they going through? And then I'm able to kind of find their voices through that. So how they speak to me, I just think it's just always different. I think it depends on the scenario and how much I've written of the book. I think the hardest part is always starting, right? Especially in indie comics, you're always recreating a world. You're constantly having to create a world and a cast. And with work for hire, those worlds have already been created. You're piggybacking off of what has been already said. So, but yeah, in indie, you gotta kind of create your own characters each and every time and try and make them different and try to have a new voice for whatever you're trying to write. But yeah, I think it has to do with the predicament. Whatever their challenge is how they stick out to me. And
So you've worked with comics that are both print and digital. Am I right in that?
yeah, so the digital comics, they still were released in print, but I've sold in print and digital.
Are there different considerations that need to be in play when you're thinking about digital or print as a format, or is it basically the same science?
No, that's a really good question. I don't think it is because with print, the thing you're worrying about is the page turn. So that's like a big thing is that you want to get your exciting moments. Hopefully you can on an even page number because that's the page turn. So when you're thinking of your cliffhanger or your splash page or whatever, that's kind of in your head what you're thinking of print. And then also with print, you have to have a certain number of pages for your comic to actually print. So everything has to be in fours because of just the way how the pages land. So in that regard, you're always kind of thinking, I don't want to say scientifically because you're not, but more methodically, I guess, just to figure out your page count and how that all works. Digitally, you can kind of do whatever you want because it's the same scrolling feature, right? So it's just like the page turn doesn't matter as much because you're reading it either in a guided view, you're reading it panel by panel, or you're just scrolling down. Webtoons is another very interesting format. I haven't used yet, but I do read Webtoons. It's kind of interesting to see how that's different in reading as well, because reading on your phone is different than reading on your computer or whatever. So you also have to consider the different audiences. And I guess even in digital and physical, there are different audiences for sure. Who's buying a digital comic, who's buying a physical comic. So yeah, you're always thinking about it. I don't want to say that should paralyze you and be like, oh my God, my digital readers won't like this. Like you should, each time will still be a good story, but you're getting a different experience. I do think writing physically is the hardest thing though. It definitely is the hardest part of the job.
I love Webtoons. I have just been, just in general, so surprised by how far Webtoons have come, in the last probably 10 years or so, They've gone from this largely, rough, amateur medium to something just really polished and really interesting. And even when new artists do it, the kind of stuff they're producing these days, it's just fun to read.
I agree. It's interesting because it's also so different because the audiences are so different. I do think that I hope that regular comics and our medium tries to get into webtoons a little bit more. I've seen it here and there, but I don't think they're really taking it to the fullest, especially like Marvel or DC. I think they went there. Oh man, I really think they do a good job. Or at least, yeah, I think find a different audience because the audience is different. You're not really going to find your superhero comics there. You're going to find your romance comics. You're going to find comedy comics. And again, the way it flows is different. You don't have a 22-page story. You sometimes only have like 2 pages to tell a story, which is interesting. But yeah, I actually like webtoons as like kind of escapism to my regular job because it is so different. It's like I could read something completely different that has nothing to do with reviewing comics, but it's still a comic. So you as a comic creator and a person that writes about comics, it's still so interesting to see that format and be like, why are people not tackling this a little bit more, especially the bigger heads, because they're the ones that are going to make a difference in that regard to maybe convert comic fans there. More importantly, the millions of people that read webtoons to comic books.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. So what do you think you prefer? Are you a print person when you read comics, or do you prefer digital or somewhere in between?
I am definitely a print gal. I grew up reading print comics, and I feel like I slow down when I read print comics, like because I read digital comics for work sometimes. If it's not on my pull list, and I'm just like, okay, I got a review copy, I need to do an interview, like I'll read a digital comic. It's not like I'm against it, but I definitely rather read it physically because you take your time with it. And again, like I said before, like the page turn is so important, and it's just so authentic. And I feel like I definitely digest it more reading it physically than I do digitally.
Are you actively reading comics at the moment?
Oh yeah. So I read about, I'd say the average is 15 a week, 15 comics a week, because I do review comics. So I review comics on a weekly basis. So I read from Marvel, I read from DC, and I read from indies, and I also read Kickstarter comics. Like I read Webtoons. I really try to read everything and just anything that interests me. But yeah, currently from Marvel, the stuff I really like is Runaways, Miss Marvel, stuff like that. I really enjoy. But that's really cool to see kind of like the indie style of Marvel too. Like Immortal Hulk kind of feels a little indie to me. Thor kind of feels a little indie to me right now. And then DC is they're in future state right now, so it's a little harder to talk about because they're in like this wide line event for 2 months. So those books won't exist in the next month. But speaking on the new books that are coming out, I'm really excited for Mariko Tamaki taking over Detective Comics. That's going to be really cool. We got Tom Taylor on Nightwing with the same creative team as Injustice Gods Among Us. So a lot of interesting stuff coming up from them. And then indies. There's so many great indies out there. I love Firepower from Robert Kirkman right now is really good. Family Tree is a good one that's ending from Jeff Lemire. Red Mother just ended, and that's such a good horror comic. If you want to read a horror comic, it's paced so well. Boom's got a lot of great stuff out there. Power Rangers, I mean, they're delving into different franchises. So out of the top of my head, those are my recommendations. But there is a lot of great comics out there that I hope people are reading.
Nice. So does the experience of creating comics change the way you read comics as a fan?
Yeah, I think so. I think, if I'm being completely honest, sometimes when I read a really good comic, I'm like, oh man, how can you be as good as this, right? And I feel like every writer feels that way. And I feel like just dissecting comics differently. But like, again, it's hard to say because I also critique comics for such a long time. So I think just being a critic has changed the way I read comics because I think other people be like, oh, that was a cool comic. But me, I'll just be like, oh, and this was good, and this was whatever, and this meant this and this and that. So I think being a critic actually has shaped the way I read comics a little differently. More than being a creator, I think I appreciate more comics because of it, for sure. Just knowing how much hard work went into it. Or honestly, I think as a creator, I forgive being delayed a little bit more, because I think a lot of people are just like, well, where's my comic? Why didn't it come out this month? And then you got to understand how much production actually goes into a comic and how lucky you are to get a comic every month. So I think in that regard, I just respect the craft more.
Nice. Can we talk about that? The production.
Yeah.
Are there a ton of just unexpected challenges that you wouldn't know about until you go off and do it?
Yeah, for sure. I think everything's a little challenge. Yeah, I think it just going from like Kickstarter, there's challenges, like that's a whole different beast. There's challenges from, okay, well, how long's my lettering going to take? How long is the coloring going to take? You know, sometimes you're waiting for pages longer than you expect, or sometimes you get pages quicker than you expect. So, I think that's the thing. It's just that there's so many gears in this machine. Sometimes one gear is a little slower. Sometimes one gear is a little faster. And you got to just put it all together and still make a machine. So I think that's something I definitely have learned throughout this process, and continue to learn throughout the process, is how to talk to people, and you know, productivity and stuff like that. And yeah, just how much goes into a comic. It's not just a writer and artist. It is a colorist. It's a letterer. It's a graphic designer. If you're getting a logo done, it's the printer. You have to talk to, and all this, you know, adds up to money as well. And you know, how do you create a budget? How do you, yeah, there's so many big things that go into comics and promoting comics and creating comics.
So you've used Kickstarter a couple of times now. How do you get your Kickstarter campaign right?
You know, that's a really good question. Luckily, in the past couple of years, I've kind of been able to study Kickstarter in a lot of ways because of my journalism job as well. So for my journalism job, I've done a couple of articles about Kickstarter. So like that has helped in just talking to people. I got to talk to the person who used to work as the comics head of Kickstarter, and just had like a nice hour chat with her for an interview. So like that's an experience. I got to talk to Scott Snyder in an interview about his Kickstarter. And, you know, so just talking to people has been really eye-opening and learning. And yeah, as you go along, you kind of figure out, quote unquote, how to get backers and like how to promote your book. And you figure out some tricks of the trade. But that you learn something new every campaign, what you could have done better, and how you improve. And you have to look at yourself. And I think a lot of times with Kickstarter or just creating, some people are like, I'm perfect. I could keep doing the same thing. But why am I keep getting the same results? I want to do better. It's like, because you didn't learn. Like, there's always an opportunity to learn. Even if you think you're the best person in the planet, you can do better, because like no one's perfect. So every campaign you should learn something. Even if you've done it for 50 times, that 51st time, you're going to learn something new to try to improve yourself, try to do something different. So I think that's a big thing with Kickstarter and creating in general, is just always learn, always keep your mind open, and try to analyze what you did. And, you know, how do you get Project We Love? How do you share it better? And how you use social media better? How do you connect to your backers better? How do you make a better product? So I think, yeah, throughout the time, it's just, you always got to be on yourself a little bit and just be like, okay, how can I improve?
Neat. So with a lot of modern indie comics, I think the large perception, and it's something that's largely true, is that, there isn't really anybody holding the gate closed anymore with creative ideas. Indie comics are just out there, and people are expressing and creating so many new things that just couldn't be done before. Does the economics of Kickstarter sort of change that? Does it change what you can say or should say when you create a comic?
No, I don't think so. I do think that Kickstarter really helps the gates just be even wider open, because you're getting, again, Scott Snyder on there, Jimmy Palmiotti, but then you're getting people like me, or you're getting newcomers, and they're all in the same pool. We're all trying to do the same thing, even if we're trying to tell different stories. So yeah, I don't think there is. I think it actually helps kind of widen this connection, but show, yeah, there's all these different comics, and you could back up Keanu Reeves comic in 1 minute, and then another comic you could back up an anthology or whatever, because it's all in one place, which is kind of cool.
That is neat. That is neat. So we're heading towards the speculative question part of the show. Are you ready for it?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Awesome. Okay, so you wake up one morning and you're imbued with superpowers. You're a superhero of some kind. What are you in terms of being a superhero? What do your powers look like?
Yeah, I always make a joke because I've gotten the question of like what superpowers would you have? I have two answers, I guess. One answer is the non-joke answer is like, oh, I think flight would be interesting because I'm scared of heights. So the fear of heights is the fear of falling. So I think that'd be kind of cool. I always make the joke of like if I was really a superhero in the world, I feel like one of my favorite shows is Secret World of Alex Mack, which is crazy. It's an old show. But what I loved about that show was that she wasn't really a superhero. She just kind of used her powers for her, like just to be her. And it was just an extra limb in some way. So I don't know if I'd be that selfish and not use it for anything, but I don't know. Would I go out in tights and be a superhero? I'm not sure. I think I tried maybe to help my fellow person in smaller ways, I guess. But yeah, I don't know if I'd go out with a cape and help people that way. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think because it's so interesting to think of it in like a realistic point of view. Would you go out there and yeah, wear tights? I don't know. I don't think so. But I would want to help people in a different way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you would use your powers to help people rather than like be a villain or an anti-hero.
Yeah, I think I'd help people in a different way, right? Like, I don't think I'd stop bank robberies. I think I try to help the individual person a little bit more. Maybe they're struggling with something in the day, and just like you want to help them with your powers in a different way.
Nice. Nice. I love that. So what's your favorite food?
Ooh, that's a good question. My favorite food, because I think it's always an interesting question to ask. Like, if you could only eat one food ever, what would it be? And I think it'd be buffalo wings. Like, I could stay every day and just be like buffalo wings. I could have that every day. So yeah, that's the answer to that one.
Nice. Nice. So are we talking like extra spicy or mild or something in
Oh,
between?
extra spicy. Love
Nice.
spicy. So.
I'd agree with you on that one. Buffalo wings are a great choice. A little messy, but a good choice.
Yeah, they are a little messy. That's the only downside, but they are delicious. So I'll forgive them.
So, Kat, it looks like that is about the end of our show. Thank you for being such an amazing guest.
Thank you.
Where can people find you on the internet and get some of these amazing comics?
Yeah, so if you want to find my comics, my Etsy store, Comic Uno, you can find all the comics that are available right now. Best way to support me though is when you see a Kickstarter live. So that I was gonna say like Follow Like Daughter. The Color Dancer issue 1 is going live at the beginning of March. So really excited about that. And I'm just excited to get that story out there, and it's all color now. So you could definitely support that Kickstarter. Got a couple of Kickstarters coming up in 2021. So look forward to that. And the best place to follow me news-wise is Twitter. @Comic Uno is definitely where I talk the most. But also follow my YouTube channel if you enjoy my thoughts on comics. I do it on a weekly basis for my comic reviews, and I'll do topics about comics. So definitely go check out my stuff over there as well.
Hey, it's time to close the show. And that means I need to thank the most beautiful, incredible, amazing person in the universe. And that's you. We couldn't do any of this without your love, support, and ongoing encouragement. Thank you. Titular Characters is produced and hosted by the adorable Eva Webb. That's me, completely. I am adorable, and you should remember that. Sound services by Brogan Malloy. Opening theme by Antonia Marquis. Closing theme by Mikey Flash and Speed Force Music. And that's it, my babies. That's all we got. Join us next time for another exciting adventure in cyberspace. Love yas.